This morning I can tell you that we have recovered what we believe is the weapon that was used in yesterday's shooting. It is a high-powered bolt-action rifle. That rifle was recovered in a wooded area where the shooter had fled. The FBI laboratory will be analyzing this weapon.
It begins with what should have been the simplest fact in the world. A man is shot. A bullet is recovered. From that moment forward, every step of justice should have flowed from a single, basic question. Which gun fired that bullet? That answer should have been the anchor, the foundation, the first stone in the wall of truth. And yet, in Charlie Kirk's case, that most basic bridge has never been built. The public was shown a rifle, a Mauser 3006, found abandoned in the woods, its chamber holding one spent casing, its magazine still heavy with 3 live rounds. To the cameras, it was presented like a trophy. The murder weapon, they called it. But beneath that headline lies a silence so loud it drowns out the certainty we were promised. Because the bullet taken from Charlie Kirk's body, the one truth no one could deny, has never been confirmed to match that rifle. That is not a minor oversight. That is the crack at the very center of the case. Ballistics is not guesswork. It is not theory. It is one of the simplest and most reliable sciences in forensic investigation. Every bullet carries the fingerprint of the barrel that fired it. Microscopic grooves, striations as unique as a fingerprint. If the bullet and the rifle do not align, then the weapon shown is not the weapon used. Without that connection, a rifle is not proof. It is theater. And theater, no matter how convincing, cannot stand in the place of truth. So let us ask, why has this most basic question never been answered publicly? Why were we given images of a rifle, solemn nods from officials, and carefully staged press conferences, yet never the one test that matters most? If the link existed, wouldn't it have been shouted from the rooftops, displayed as the bedrock of the case? Why show us a gun before proving it belonged to the bullet? Why rush to present a symbol of closure before delivering the substance of it? Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. Think about the sequence. The doctor who tried to save Charlie Kirk gave us the first undeniable fact. There was a bullet, torn through flesh, the cruel evidence of violence that no one could dispute. That should have been the beginning of clarity. Instead, it became the heart of confusion. Because what he described, the caliber, the wound, the trajectory, did not neatly line up with the rifle investigators paraded days later as the answer. The first truth came from a doctor in the immediacy of tragedy. The second truth came from officials behind microphones. And between those two truths, the bridge has never been built. This raises more than a technical concern. It raises a moral one. If the first fact in the case doesn't add up, what else has been hidden? What else has been shaped, managed, or buried in silence? How many times have we been shown an image of certainty while the underlying evidence remained unspoken? How many times has comfort been chosen over clarity? Consider what this means for the family. Imagine being told, "We have the murder weapon," only to learn that no one has ever proven the weapon and the bullet belong to each other. Imagine waking up each day with grief already heavy on your chest, and then realizing that even the evidence used to frame justice for your husband, your father, your son, may be little more than theater. Is it fair to ask a grieving family to carry that silence as well? And what about us, the public? We are not experts in ballistics, but we know the basics. A bullet either matches a gun or it doesn't. This is not advanced science. This is not a riddle. So why has the simplest question of all remained unanswered? Was the test never run? Was it run and found inconvenient? Or was it done, but the results filed away because they didn't support the clean narrative of a lone shooter with a single rifle? Each of these possibilities points not to closure, but to doubt. That doubt grows heavier when we remember how quickly the rifle was announced. Within hours of recovery, officials spoke of it as if the case was solved. But speed is not proof. Speed is comfort, momentum, performance. And once a story hardens in the public mind, the rifle was found, the killer is caught. Any detail that contradicts it is dismissed as noise. Witnesses who say the sound came from another direction, confused. A doctor whose description doesn't align perfectly, misremembered. A trajectory that raises questions, overlooked. In the gravity of speed, everything that doesn't fit is pushed aside, so we must pause here, at the very beginning, before we rush ahead, before we bury another truth in silence. The bullet is real, the rifle is real, but the bridge between them is missing. And until that bridge is built, justice remains unfinished. Ask yourself, what does it mean when the first truth comes from a doctor's hands and the second truth comes from an image on a podium, yet the two have never been tied together? What does it mean when institutions choose to display symbols of closure instead of proving the facts that closure requires? And most of all, what does it mean for every other piece of this case if the most basic test, the first step any investigator should take, has either not been done or not been shared? The contradiction is not hidden in the shadows. It is sitting in plain sight. A bullet without a barrel, a rifle without a match, a case without its anchor. And until we confront that contradiction, every word of justice spoken about Charlie Kirk remains suspended in uncertainty. And so we step forward, not into resolution, but into deeper inquiry. Because to understand this case, we must not only ask what was presented, but also what was withheld. The bullet and the rifle opened the story, but the silence between them demands we keep going. If the first contradiction lies between a bullet and a rifle, then the next step is obvious. Ballistics. Because ballistics is not mystery, not theory, not speculation. It is the simplest science in the world of firearms. A bullet is never silent about its origin. When it is fired, the barrel carves its identity into the metal. Grooves twist, striations etch, microscopic ridges leave their fingerprint. To match a bullet to a gun, all you need to do is place one under a microscope, compare it to the other, and let the evidence speak. It is a process so routine that thousands of cases across decades have lived and died by it. So why not here? Why, in the case of Charlie Kirk, have we never been shown that most basic confirmation? The doctor told us a bullet existed. Investigators told us a rifle was recovered, but between those two truths should stand a laboratory test. Simple, visual, undeniable. The striations line up. The bullet fits the barrel. That's it. That's what justice should rest on. But in this case, silence took its place. Let's slow this down. Imagine the scene in a forensic lab. The bullet extracted from Charlie Kirk's body lies on a tray. The rifle, the Mauser 3006, bolt action, heavy with 3 live rounds, sits ready for testing. The examiner cleans it, prepares it, then fires a controlled round into a water tank, retrieving an intact bullet to serve as a reference. Side by side, under a comparison microscope, the truth should leap into view. Do the grooves match? Do the striations align? If yes, the case strengthens. If no, the case cracks wide open. There is no in-between. And yet this in-between is exactly where we have been left. Neither confirmation nor contradiction has been shared. The most basic forensic test has been swallowed in silence, which forces us to ask, was it never done? Or was it done, and the result too inconvenient to announce? Consider the possibilities. If the bullet did match the rifle, why not show it? Why not display the comparison images, the lab report, the chart where the markings line up like a fingerprint? That would have been the headline. That would have been the proof the family deserved, the closure the public demanded. If the bullet matched, silence makes no sense. But if the bullet did not match, if the grooves disagreed, if the striations told another story, then everything collapses. The murder weapon displayed on television becomes a prop, not proof. The certainty announced in press conferences turns to theater, and the prosecution's lone wolf narrative begins to unravel before it even leaves the courtroom. History is filled with cases where ballistics changed everything. Convictions overturned when bullets were tested again and found inconsistent. Suspects freed after decades in prison because grooves didn't align the way investigators once claimed. Entire trials derailed because the science, simple as it is, refused to bend to the narrative. Ballistics doesn't care about press conferences. It doesn't care about convenience. It only cares about truth. And that is why the silence here is so dangerous. By withholding, by refusing to confirm, institutions are not protecting the integrity of the case. They are eroding it. Because once the public realizes that even the simplest test has not been shared, every other claim begins to look suspect. If the barrel's fingerprint can't be proven, what about the DNA on the towel? If the bullet doesn't fit, what about the half-burned note? If the most basic connection is absent, why should anyone trust the rest? Think about it. What is more unsettling? The idea that the test was never performed, or that it was performed and hidden. One points to negligence, the other points to control. Both are failures. Both betray the very purpose of forensic science, which exists to provide clarity when emotion, rumor, and chaos cloud the air. And in this case, clarity was desperately needed. So we are left with questions that should haunt every investigator, every prosecutor, every citizen. Was the bullet ever placed under a microscope beside a test round from that rifle? If so, where is the report? Where are the images? Where is the testimony that should have anchored this case? And if not, why was the weapon paraded as the answer before the science was even done? Ballistics does not take weeks. It does not take months. It takes hours. The equipment exists in every major forensic lab. This was not a question of capability. It was a question of will. And here is the most chilling thought. When institutions choose silence over ballistics, they are not avoiding complexity. They are avoiding simplicity. They are avoiding the one truth that cannot be spun, polished, or reframed. A bullet either fits or it does not. And if it does not, then everything we've been told about this case hangs by a thread. So before we move forward, before we analyze witnesses, timelines, or motives, we must pause here. Because if the science of ballistics is ignored, or worse, buried, then the case is not built on truth. It is built on silence. And silence is not justice. Silence is control. The unanswered question lingers, pressing forward into the heart of the case. If the bullet and the rifle do not belong to each other, then what else doesn't belong? What other pieces have been forced together to create a picture of certainty that cannot withstand the weight of proof? And this is where we must turn next. Because once the science is silent, attention shifts to the stagecraft, the image of a rifle held high, the theater of certainty presented to the public. And we must ask, was the weapon evidence or was it a performance? When science goes quiet, images get louder. And in Charlie Kirk's case, silence around ballistics was quickly replaced with something else. Spectacle. A rifle, lifted from the woods, carried solemnly through the cameras, displayed as if its very presence was enough to convict. This was not proof, this was performance. And the danger of performance is that it looks so much like justice that we forget to ask whether justice is actually being served. Think of the sequence. A doctor gives the first undeniable fact. A bullet exists. That should have been the anchor of everything that followed. Instead, attention shifted almost overnight from the wound in Kirk's body to the weapon in investigators' hands. A Mauser 3006 bolt-action rifle, abandoned, chamber holding one spent casing, magazine carrying 3 more, casings found nearby etched with chilling phrases, as if mocking the very concept of closure. These details were not presented as questions, they were staged as answers. This is the weapon, this is the story, case closed. But was it? Ask yourself, why was the rifle shown to the public before it was matched to the bullet? Why were reporters handed images, press releases, and sound bites instead of lab reports, comparison slides, and ballistic charts? Why were we encouraged to feel closure before the simplest connection was ever proven? Because in the theater of public perception, symbols often matter more than science. A rifle in the hands of agents looks definitive. A press conference feels authoritative. Photographs of officials nodding gravely project certainty. These are images designed to reassure, to control, to fill the void where actual proof has not yet been offered. And the public, desperate for clarity after chaos, often accepts those images as truth. But what happens when imagery takes the place of evidence? What happens when a weapon is paraded like a trophy instead of tested like a tool? The answer is simple. Narrative hardens. Once the public sees the gun, once they hear the phrase, "the murder weapon has been found," every later contradiction sounds like noise. Witnesses who disagree, confused, details that don't align, minor. Questions about trajectory, timing, or placement, overcomplicated. The image becomes stronger than the facts, and this is not new. History has shown us how institutions use theater to cement narratives before evidence has caught up. From crime scenes staged for the press to smoking guns that later unraveled, the lesson repeats. Once an image lodges in the public mind, it is almost impossible to dislodge, no matter what the science says later. Was that the point here? To give us closure so quickly, so forcefully, that we wouldn't question the gaps. Think of the language used. Officials didn't say, "A rifle has been recovered and is under examination." They said, "The murder weapon has been found." They didn't say, "A suspect is under review." They said, "We have our shooter." Each word chosen not for caution, but for certainty. Certainty that may not have been earned yet. Certainty that may have been theater. And the public, caught in the wake of tragedy, was ready to believe. Fear makes us crave answers. Grief makes us accept conclusions. When lives are shattered, when chaos reigns, people don't want complexity. They want clarity. Institutions know this. They know that symbols heal faster than science, that images quiet questions, at least for a while. And so we were given a rifle, not a report, a performance, not proof. But here's the problem. Performances don't hold up in court. They don't withstand the scrutiny of history. And they don't satisfy families who know that every unanswered question is another layer of grief. Imagine being told the weapon that killed your loved one has been found, only to learn later that no one can prove the bullet in his body ever came from it. Is that justice, or is that control? So we must ask, who benefits from this kind of theater? For prosecutors, a clean story is easier to argue than a complicated one. For institutions, an image of resolution protects them from criticism about security failures or investigative missteps. For the public, closure feels comforting, but for the truth, theater is poison. It buries complexity under spectacle. It silences the simplest questions, and it convinces us that an answer has been given when, in fact, the answer is still missing. Look again at the rifle. Look again at the casings with their mocking inscriptions. Look again at the press conferences that declared finality before the science had even begun. Do you feel certainty, or do you feel staging? Was the rifle evidence, or was it a prop meant to satisfy the cameras while the real test sat silent? And if this was theater, what role did we, the public, play in it? Did we accept the image because we wanted closure? Did we nod along because doubt was too heavy to carry? Did we mistake a symbol for a fact because it was easier than demanding proof? These questions do not vanish with time. They grow louder. Because if a rifle can be paraded as proof without a ballistic match, what else in this case has been presented for performance rather than truth? What other details have been shaped for comfort rather than clarity? What other silences have been buried beneath spectacle? And here lies the pivot point. If ballistics was ignored and imagery was elevated, then this case is not just about evidence. It is about responsibility. Responsibility of investigators, of institutions, of those who chose to display symbols instead of sharing facts. And responsibility cannot be dodged by theater forever. Which leads us to the next question, the one we must face head-on. When silence and theater combine, who carries the blame? Is it the shooter alone, or is it the entire system that allowed theater to replace truth? At some point, the rifle and the bullet stop being the center of the story, because the contradiction between them, this silence, this theater, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists because people made choices about what to test, what to announce, what to display, and what to bury. And when choices shape truth, responsibility spreads outward, far beyond a single shooter or a single piece of evidence. Think about the chain of duty. Investigators are tasked with recovering and testing evidence. Forensic examiners are charged with delivering clarity, not comfort. Prosecutors are sworn to seek justice, not just conviction. Institutions, universities, police departments, government agencies carry the burden of transparency. In Charlie Kirk's case, each link in that chain appears strained, if not broken. And when one link fails, the weight shifts. When several fail at once, it is not just a mistake, it is a systemic failure. Start with the investigators. Why parade a rifle as the murder weapon before matching it to the bullet? Why hold a press conference with photographs and solemn statements instead of waiting for ballistic confirmation? Was this about urgency, or was it about optics? Did investigators fear that hesitation would make them appear weak, unprepared, or incompetent? Or was it simply easier to present a neat answer than to admit that certainty takes time? Now the forensic teams. Ballistics is their realm. It is their responsibility to run the tests, to compare the grooves, to provide the proof. If they did, why have we never seen the report? Why has no forensic examiner stepped forward to testify that the bullet fits the barrel? If they didn't, why was the weapon declared the murder weapon at all? Was this a lapse in protocol or a conscious decision to delay the truth? Then come the prosecutors. Their job is not to perform for cameras, but to build cases that can withstand scrutiny in a courtroom. Did they push too fast, leaning on the rifle as a symbol because they knew the public wanted closure? Did they gamble that certainty in headlines would outweigh questions in evidence? If so, what does that say about justice, when winning the perception war becomes more important than winning the truth? And finally, the institutions, Utah Valley University, law enforcement agencies, the officials who stood behind podiums. Their responsibility was not just to keep Kirk safe that night, but to keep the public informed afterward. Why were rooftops not cleared before the event? Why were crucial details delayed while convenient ones were rushed forward? Why was silence chosen over transparency and performance chosen over patience? Each question adds weight, and that weight does not fall on a single pair of shoulders. It stretches across a system designed to protect life, preserve truth, and deliver justice. When that system chooses speed over rigor, silence over clarity, and theater over transparency, it is no longer protecting the public. It is protecting itself. So we must ask, who benefits from these failures? Was silence about ballistics meant to shield investigators from embarrassment? Was the quick declaration of a murder weapon meant to insulate institutions from criticism over security lapses? Was the public narrative shaped to protect reputations rather than uncover truth? If so, then this was not just negligence. It was self-preservation at the cost of justice. And history reminds us of the cost of such failures. Forensic oversights have overturned convictions decades later. Mishandled evidence has freed the guilty and imprisoned the innocent. Institutions that once promised safety have seen trust crumble because they chose control over clarity. Every time silence replaces science, every time performance replaces proof, the system itself goes on trial. And here we are again. Charlie Kirk's death is no longer just about a gunman, a rifle, or a bullet. It is about the silence that followed, the theater that replaced truth, and the institutions that allowed it to happen. Responsibility has spread like ink in water, staining not only the accused, but the very structures meant to hold the line. But responsibility is heavy, and institutions rarely carry it willingly, which forces the question back onto us. What happens when the system designed to deliver justice becomes the one that buries it? If silence protects the powerful, who speaks for the victim? If theater convinces the public, who demands the science? If institutions fail, where does responsibility finally land? And perhaps most unsettling, if this silence, this performance, this failure could shape the story of Charlie Kirk. How many other stories have been shaped the same way? How many truths have been managed instead of revealed? How many families have been told closure while the real answers were locked away? This is not just a story about one man's death. It is a test of every layer of responsibility. And the more we look, the clearer it becomes. This is not only a shooter's failure, it is a system's failure. But failure is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a reckoning. And that reckoning is not confined to courtrooms or campuses. It plays out in the public square, in the voices of families, in the division of communities, in the nation's struggle to define justice, which leads us forward to the final and most difficult question. When the system fails, how does the public respond? Do we accept the theater as truth? Or do we demand the silence be broken, no matter the cost? When silence takes hold and institutions retreat behind theater, the weight does not simply vanish. It shifts. It falls onto the people left behind. The families forced to grieve in uncertainty, and the public asked to believe in a story that may never have been proven. And in Charlie Kirk's case, that weight has divided the nation as sharply as the shot that ended his life. For some, the narrative is complete. Tyler James Robinson, 22 years old, is guilty beyond doubt. They see the rifle, the DNA on the towel, the burned note, and they believe the pieces add up to certainty. They ask why anyone would want to complicate it, why anyone would look for shadows where the story already has closure. For them, demanding more is an insult to the victim, a delay in justice, a refusal to accept what has been plainly declared. But for others, the silence around the bullet and the rifle is a wound that will not heal. They remember the doctor's words, the most immediate truth. There was a bullet. And they cannot understand why that truth was never connected, never tested, never spoken alongside the weapon officials paraded before the cameras. To them, every unanswered question is a betrayal. Every silence is a signal. Every performance is proof not of guilt, but of control. And in the middle of this division stands a widow. Erica Kirk's response was unlike anything the public expected. At a memorial that filled a stadium, she spoke not with fury, but with forgiveness. She said she would not seek Robinson's death in return for Charlie's. She refused to let blood for blood become the measure of justice. Her words struck like a second shockwave, disarming some, unsettling others, leaving the nation unsure of how to respond. Was this grace, or was it surrender? Was it an act of strength, or did it risk letting institutions off the hook? Her voice did not erase the questions, but it reframed them. What does justice truly mean, if not punishment? And still, the questions multiplied. Why was the rifle displayed before the ballistics were proven? Why were rooftops not cleared before the event? Why were some witnesses heard and others dismissed? Why was silence chosen at every turn when clarity was possible? These are not conspiracy theories. They are the natural consequences of a story that left too many gaps. The public response has become its own courtroom, sprawling across living rooms, comment sections, auditoriums, and airwaves. On one side, people demand swift punishment. On the other, they demand patient truth. Both claim the banner of justice, but their visions of justice could not be more different. One sees closure in conviction, the other sees closure only when silence is broken and every unanswered question has been faced. This division matters because it tells us that justice is no longer only a legal process. It is a public struggle, fought in narratives as much as in courtrooms. And in that struggle, silence is deadly. Silence doesn't just protect institutions, it breeds suspicion, hardens divisions, and convinces half the nation that the other half is blind. Every delay becomes a conspiracy. Every unanswered question becomes proof of corruption. And the more silence persists, the harder it becomes to believe in any official story at all. So we must ask ourselves, what happens when public trust collapses? What happens when families and citizens no longer believe the system is capable of telling the truth? What happens when justice is seen not as a process, but as a performance staged to calm the crowd? Do we disengage, resigning ourselves to cynicism? Or do we demand, louder than ever, that silence be broken? Because this case is not just about Charlie Kirk. It is about what we are willing to accept as truth. If we accept symbols over science, theater over testing, silence over transparency, then we train institutions to keep giving us performance instead of proof. But if we demand more, if we insist on the test, the report, the detail no one wants to say aloud, then maybe silence loses its power. Charlie Kirk's death should have been investigated with patience, precision, and honesty. Instead, it has become a mirror reflecting the failures of systems, the fragility of trust, and the struggle of a nation to decide what justice really means. And until the silence around the bullet and the rifle is broken, the case remains unfinished, not just in the courtroom, but in every conversation, every debate, every question whispered by those who still refuse to let the story end this way. So ask yourself, will we settle for performance, or will we demand proof? Will we accept silence, or will we insist it be broken? Justice does not move on its own. It moves only when people refuse to let half-truths pass for answers. And until that day comes, justice for Charlie Kirk remains suspended, not denied forever, but not delivered either. It hangs in the silence, waiting for those willing to carry its weight. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.